that the places where your own imagination can perhaps fill in the gaps, where you can meet the experience of the author. So not every single thing should be spelled out. And I really obviously respond to writing. What I find I connect with the most is in a great specificity and getting very specific in describing taste, smell, you know, the way that the light falls on someone's glasses. I actually find myself there, transported, but in that, I also find I identify my own personal experiences. And that's really, really important for me, is to, in the very specific, we find the universal. And you find yourself, and you find your own experiences. And so I wanted to also emphasize that, again, I imagine that there will be perceptions, obviously, about my memoir, and amongst them, which would be very legitimate, is that it's a cancer memoir, that it all has to do with my battling this disease, which I've been very public about. And in a sense, it's not. I do cover my cancer experiences, but that comes much later. Although, having said that, cancer was the launching pad for writing this memoir, because initially that's why I was approached to write this. And I was approached off of a blog that I had written called The Yellow Diaries, in which I chronicled it with what came before, you know? And, you know, it's also connected with a part of my Buddhist philosophy, which is something that has also deeply influenced my personal worldview and my healing. So if my disease does not happen in isolation from the rest of my life, how far back do I have to go? And I realized that I had to start from the beginning, and the beginning was actually my parents' story. So even though I actually start the memoir with describing myself, preparing myself to actually share my diagnosis of cancer publicly on the red carpet at the Toronto International Film Festival, after that I segue into my childhood, but more importantly into my parents. And this was a revelation for me in writing the book. If I had to pick a single revelation, something that I didn't anticipate, it was my parents, you know. So as I said, I kind of fancy myself a bohemian, a rebel, someone who challenges the norm. Where did that come from? And I realized that it was passed on in what I describe my kaleidoscopic genes. You know, my father's a Bengali, my mother's Polish, and between the two of them, they created this strange creature.
You go beyond your parents to your grandparents
and
as well.
And also to my grandparents.
So
Thank you for reminding me.
A lot of the book, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in setup, right? Starting from your Bengali grandfather, who was a judge, him sitting in his planter's chair in this palatial Calcutta home reading Jugantor, which is a specific type of intellectual, read that. And to your Polish grandmother, who divided the world into elegant and not elegant.
Non-elegant, yes.
So, which is what I wanted to kind of ask you next about how important context was to you, but you've kind of already answered that. In a way, you know, your rebellious spirit and your kind of love for travel and adventure was something that your parents sowed in you. I mean, they picked up and just moved to Bombay and lived in ISKCON, which is a wild story in itself, when you were 16. And your mother was sneaking in chicken soup into the all-vegetarian ISKCON living quarters.
No.
So yeah, so I think a little bit of your naughty streak is possibly from them.
And it's interesting because we normally don't frame our parents and our lineage in those terms, particularly when we're younger, you know. We see our parents through a very different framework, you know. They are more, perhaps sometimes, they're the rule makers, you know. They provide a safe container for us, but they also provide borders and rules that you're not supposed to traverse. And, you know, when I actually started speaking to my father, I said, tell me a little bit more, because he was always a little bit shy about sharing the entire breadth of my parents' romance, because it was not easy in those days for a Pole and a Bengali Brahmin to get together. Like, that was quite a spicy romance, but they would always get kind of giggle behind their hands whenever they confronted them and questioned them about it. So I kind of pinned him down and got him to tell me about that, but more importantly, about how My father was essentially excommunicated from his family. It was a very liberal family, a very educated family, but still excommunicated from his family for not marrying the woman of his family's choice. And how my parents had to then make a go of it independently. And the choices that they made, I think in any context, but even more so for the period in which they were living, you know, the 50s and the 60s, was extremely rebellious, extremely brave, extremely visionary, and very ahead of their times. But I did not see it that way. And today I can see that this rebellious streak, basically, I had no choice in the matter but to become a rebel and to basically challenge a lot of things. It was basically embedded in my marrow. From my blood, it was embedded in my marrow. And as I said, the choices that both my parents made and that I ended up making would both, I guess, they were provided a lot of blessings and a lot of trauma, both, you know. But, you know, that is the responsibility inherent in our lives, is we do have to take responsibility for our choices. And I do also want to say, Anandita, you had actually brought this up, that there's a lot of joy also, even though I write very frankly about a lot of the obstacles and trauma and difficulties. I've also studied a certain amount of, immersed myself in asking questions, not necessarily always finding the answers, but asking the questions, immersing myself in Buddhism, immersing myself in a lot of Osho's teachings, in a lot of, you know, going on a spiritual road trip, which is kind of wild, in a golden car, and not necessarily finding the answers, but in like it or not, is the true reality of this world that we inhabit. Once you kind of become more comfortable with that, in whatever way it takes you to become comfortable with that, and life has certainly thrown a lot of experiences in my way. Okay, if you didn't learn that lesson, here's another lesson to help you become comfortable with the impermanence and the constant changes in life. As I became more at ease with that, that mania in me of always having to leave has kind of smoothed out. So I still travel a lot. For instance, just 4 weeks ago, my husband and I have decided that now we've left Hong Kong and we're now based in Bombay. And just like
leaving
that.
again.
So leaving, but going to something with a kind of an intention and with a very, I try to be really, really honest with myself today. It's taken a lot of practice to get there. I'm not always successful at it. So I try to call myself on stuff. What am I actually trying to escape? I'm not escaping something. I know that I am coming to something. So the mania has left. I'm a lot more comfortable with impermanence. So I try not to get too attached to any particular situation. I watch myself. Obviously, it's a very difficult practice with family, with friends. But this idea of moving and being able to be fluid, I think, is an asset, is a very strong asset, particularly in today's world where there's a lot of migration, where the world as we know it is changing constantly around us. And I know that a lot of people are spinning out of control because of that.
You had this Ayurvedic doctor explain that to you, saying your dosha was Vata, so I guess you kind of understood it that way. There's a beautiful, at some point in the book when you understand what's going on with all this leaving, you write about how you realized you were not adrift like a leaf in a...
I've always had this ambivalent relationship with my career. I'm an accidental actress. How I've always had one foot in it, one foot out of it. And how I believe that